The December snow fell silently against the bulletproof windows of Mark Sullivan's penthouse, each crystalline flake catching the city lights before melting against the reinforced glass. 40 stories above Manhattan's chaos, the silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Mark's chest as he stared out at the Christmas Eve skyline. For 10 years, the holiday had been nothing but a cruel anniversary marking the day his world shattered. December 24th, 2014. The day his wife Sarah and 8-year-old son Tommy were killed in a car bombing meant for him. The day Mark Sullivan died inside, leaving only the ruthless shell of a mafia boss who ruled through fear and commanded respect through violence. Mark poured himself another scotch. Macallan 25, the same brand Sarah used to hide from him because she worried about his drinking. His calloused hands, stained with more blood than he could count, remained steady despite the familiar ache that consumed him every Christmas. At 42, he commanded the most powerful crime family on the East Coast. Politicians bent to his will, judges carried his money in their pockets, and grown men crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. But all the power and wealth in the world couldn't fill the void where his heart used to be. The penthouse around him reflected his emotional state: cold, sterile, expensive but empty. Italian leather furniture that no one sat in. A dining table that seated 12 but had only ever held one place setting. Abstract art worth millions decorating walls that never heard laughter. It was a mausoleum disguised as a home, a monument to everything he'd lost. "Mr. Sullivan?" Rosa Martinez's gentle voice cut through his dark thoughts like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His cleaning lady stood in the doorway of his study, her dark eyes reflecting the same quiet compassion that had puzzled him for the past 3 years. She held fresh towels in her arms, her work uniform neat despite the late hour. Rosa was 38, though her face carried a wisdom that suggested harder years than her age implied. A single mother working multiple jobs, yet she always maintained a dignity that commanded respect. He'd noticed how she watched him, not with the fear most people showed when they realized who he was, but with something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Understanding, perhaps, or worse, pity. He wasn't sure which bothered him more. Hey everyone, before we continue with Mark's story, I want you to do me a huge favor. If you're enjoying this tale of unexpected love and dangerous secrets, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I promise this story will take you on an emotional roller coaster you won't forget. There's so much more to Mark and Rosa's story that will surprise you. Now back to our lonely mafia boss and the woman who's about to change everything. What is it, Rosa? Mark's voice carried the razor edge that made hardened criminals tremble and seasoned detectives choose early retirement, but she never flinched, never showed the slightest hint of intimidation. Rosa stepped closer, setting down her cleaning supplies with deliberate care. Her movements were graceful despite her humble profession, and Mark found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for 3 years. The way she always wore a small gold cross, how her hands were gentle but strong, the fact that she hummed old Spanish lullabies while she worked. "I know it's not my place, Mr. Sullivan," Rosa began, her voice soft but determined. She paused, gathering courage for what she was about to say. "But no one should spend Christmas alone. My family and we're having dinner tomorrow. Nothing fancy, just real food, real conversation, real love. You're welcome to join us if you'd like." Mark's glass stopped halfway to his lips, crystal suspended in midair as her words registered. In 10 years of self-imposed isolation, no one had dared invite him anywhere that wasn't business-related. Politicians feared him, rivals respected him, but nobody wanted to share a meal with him. The audacity of her invitation should have triggered his anger. Instead, something shifted in his chest, a hairline crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "You don't know what you're asking," Mark said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. Rosa's chin lifted with surprising determination, her eyes meeting his without wavering. "I know exactly who you are, Mark Sullivan, but I also see who you could be." She paused, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Everyone deserves a family, especially at Christmas. Even you." Mark Sullivan stared at his reflection in the marble bathroom mirror of his penthouse, questioning his sanity for the 100th time in 12 hours. The face looking back at him was a stranger's. Expensive grooming, perfectly styled dark hair with distinguished silver at the temples, and eyes that had seen too much violence. But beneath the surface he could see something he hadn't witnessed in a decade. Uncertainty. Vulnerability. He'd actually accepted Rosa's invitation. Mark Sullivan, the man who commanded absolute loyalty from hundreds of soldiers, who made million-dollar decisions without blinking, had said yes to spending Christmas dinner with his cleaning lady and her family. The Mark Sullivan of 10 years ago, the one who'd believed love could conquer anything, who'd come home to Sarah's laughter and Tommy's excited chatter about school, would have understood. But that man had died in a car bombing on a snowy December afternoon. Yet here he was, alive again. Terrified, but alive. Mark chose his clothes with uncharacteristic care, rejecting the $5,000 Italian suits that screamed power and danger. Instead, he selected a simple black cashmere sweater and dark jeans, expensive quality but understated. He left behind the Rolex worth more than most people's annual salary, the diamond pinky ring that marked him as family, even the platinum cufflinks Sarah had given him for their anniversary. Tonight he didn't want to be Mark Sullivan, the crime boss. He wanted to be just Mark. Rosa had written her address in careful handwriting on a piece of paper, 47-12 Northern Boulevard, apartment 3B, Queens, a world away from his Manhattan empire of steel, glass, and carefully controlled violence. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, Rosa Martinez was transforming her humble home into something magical. She'd been preparing since dawn, her hands working with the same gentle precision she brought to everything. Multicolored Christmas lights twinkled around furniture that had seen better years but was maintained with loving care. The smell of her grandmother's recipe for pernil, slow-roasted pork shoulder with garlic and oregano, filled every corner of the apartment, mixing with the sense of yuca con mojo, black beans, and Elena's famous flan. Her teenage daughter Maria and 70-year-old mother Eleanor had spent the morning peppering her with questions about their mysterious guest. All they knew was that Rosa cleaned for a wealthy businessman named Mark Sullivan, and that she'd invited him to share their Christmas Eve dinner. "Mummy, are you absolutely certain about this?" Maria asked for the 5th time, carefully setting their small table with their best plates, mismatched ceramic pieces collected over years, but each one spotlessly clean and arranged with pride. At 19, Maria had inherited her mother's intelligence and her grandmother's fierce protectiveness. Rosa paused in her preparations, holding her grandmother's ceramic angel in her hands. The figurine was probably worth $20, but it had graced their tree for 3 generations. "Sometimes, Mija, we have to take a leap of faith. This man, I see pain in his eyes every day. He's drowning in loneliness, and maybe we can throw him a rope." "But what if he's dangerous?" Maria pressed. "Rich men don't usually eat Christmas dinner in Queens." Elena looked up from where she was stirring the flan. "Ay, Nieta, your mother has good instincts about people. If she says this man needs family, then we give him family." When the doorbell rang at exactly 6:30, Mark Sullivan was nothing if not punctual. Rosa's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She smoothed her simple red dress, took a deep breath that smelled like garlic and hope, and opened the door. Mark stood in her hallway looking like a man who'd stepped out of his own world and into another universe. Gone was the intimidating presence she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she saw uncertainty written across features that usually commanded absolute authority. He held an expensive bottle of wine, Opus One, though Rosa wouldn't recognize the $400 price tag, and looked completely, endearingly out of his element. "I wasn't sure what to bring to a family dinner," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding edge. "I hope wine is appropriate." Rosa's smile could have lit up the entire building. "Just yourself. That's more than enough." The dinner table practically vibrated with life as Elena Martinez regaled Mark with animated stories from her youth in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, her weathered hands gesturing expressively as she described hurricanes, family celebrations, and the small farm where she'd grown up picking coffee beans. Her Spanish-accented English flowed like music, and Mark found himself genuinely captivated by her tales of resilience and joy in the face of hardship. Maria gradually warmed to their guest as the evening progressed, especially when Mark genuinely listened to her ambitious plans for law school and offered thoughtful advice about business courses that would complement her legal studies. He spoke knowledgeably about contracts, negotiations, and the importance of understanding financial markets, though he carefully omitted where exactly he'd acquired such expertise. "You know, Mr. Sullivan," Maria said during the main course, "most adults just nod politely when I talk about my dreams. but you actually understand what I'm trying to accomplish." Mark's smile was genuine, transforming his usually stern features. Intelligence and ambition should be taken seriously, regardless of age. Your plans are well thought out and realistic. That's more than I can say for most business proposals I see. Rosa moved around the table like a graceful conductor, keeping conversations flowing seamlessly while ensuring everyone felt included and cherished. When Elena told a particularly funny story about trying to catch a runaway rooster, Rosa's laughter filled the small apartment with such pure joy that Mark found himself unable to look away. The sound was like sunshine after years of winter. Warm, life-giving, essential. The meal itself was a revelation. Mark's usual dinners consisted of expensive restaurant fare consumed alone while reviewing business reports. This was different. Food prepared with love, seasoned with tradition, shared with people who genuinely cared about each other. The pernil fell apart at the touch of a fork. The garlicky yuca practically melted in his mouth, and Elena's flan was better than anything he'd ever tasted in the finest establishments. "So, Mark," Maria said during dessert, fixing him with the direct gaze that reminded him powerfully of her mother, "what exactly do you do for work? Mum's pretty vague about it." The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Rosa's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her dark eyes finding his across the table with gentle warning. She knew this moment would come eventually, had probably been dreading it all evening. Mark chose his words with the care of a man negotiating a hostage situation. "I'm in import and export. International business mostly. I facilitate transactions between parties who need certain accommodations." It wasn't entirely a lie, though the goods he moved weren't exactly legitimate, and the accommodations often involved violence. Elena nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied with this explanation. Maria seemed to accept it as well, though something in her intelligent eyes suggested she suspected there was more to the story. Later, as they cleaned dishes together in Rosa's tiny kitchen, their arms brushed against each other as she handed him plates to dry. The simple, innocent touch sent electricity racing through both of them, a connection neither had expected, neither could deny. Mark's hands stilled on the dish towel as the sensation registered, while Rosa's breath caught in her throat. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, carrying depths of emotion he hadn't accessed in years. "For tonight, for including me, for treating me like family." Rosa turned to face him fully, studying his features in the soft kitchen light. The harsh lines of command and violence seemed softer here, more human. "Everyone deserves a family, Mark, even if it's just for one night." Something fundamental shifted in his chest at her words, not the crack from yesterday, but a complete collapse of one of his defensive walls. "I haven't felt this normal cat in so long. I'd forgotten what it was like to sit around a table and just be a person instead of a—" He stopped himself before revealing too much. "Instead of what?" Rosa asked gently, though something in her tone suggested she already knew. Mark's hands stilled completely. The pain that crossed his features was so raw, so devastating, that Rosa immediately regretted pushing. "Instead of a man whose family died because of who he is," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him, "because of what he does." Mark returned to his penthouse that Christmas night, feeling like a man awakening from a decade-long coma. Every sensation heightened and strange. The familiar luxury of his home, the Italian marble floors, the museum-quality artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of Manhattan, seemed coldly absurd after the authentic warmth he'd experienced in Rosa's modest apartment. The silence that had once felt like peace now felt oppressive, broken only by the hum of climate control and the distant sounds of a city that never slept. He poured himself a scotch and stood by his window, watching snow continue to fall on the city below. But instead of his usual brooding contemplation of loss and regret, Mark found his thoughts occupied entirely by Rosa's laugh, the way she'd defended him when he couldn't defend himself, and the shocking realization that he'd felt more alive during those 4 hours than he had in the previous 10 years, combined. The next morning brought an inevitable return to his regular world, a world Rosa couldn't possibly understand, one built on violence, intimidation, and carefully calculated fear. His lieutenant, Tony Castellano, was waiting in his private office when Mark arrived, his massive frame filling one of the leather chairs, as he spread crime scene photos and surveillance reports across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to Mark's father. "Boss, we've got a situation developing with the Morettis," Tony announced. his Brooklyn accent thick with concern. "They're making aggressive moves on our Brooklyn port operations. Yesterday, they sent Muscle to negotiate with our dock supervisors. 3 of our guys ended up in the hospital." Mark studied the surveillance photographs with practiced efficiency, his mind automatically cataloging threat levels, response options, and potential collateral damage. But something was different today. Part of his consciousness remained detached from the violence, occupied instead with memories of Maria's bright ambition and Elena's stories of resilience. How could someone like Rosa exist in the same universe as this brutality? "What's their angle?" Mark asked, though his voice lacked its usual laser focus. "Word is they think you're getting soft. Christmas alone, no family obligations, makes you unpredictable." Tony paused, studying his boss's face carefully. "They're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can push before you push back." "Handle it," Mark said dismissively, his attention already wandering. "But keep it proportional. No unnecessary casualties." Tony's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. In the old days, Mark's response to territorial challenges involved sending messages written in blood and fear. "Since when do you care about keeping things proportional?" "Since a cleaning lady reminded me that I used to be human," Mark thought but didn't say. Instead, he fixed Tony with a look that discouraged further questions. That afternoon, Rosa arrived for her regular Tuesday cleaning session. She moved through his penthouse with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for 3 years, but Mark found himself watching her with completely different eyes. He noticed details he'd somehow overlooked, despite seeing her twice a week. The way she hummed soft Spanish melodies while polishing surfaces, how she always arranged his books with mathematical precision, the fact that she never touched his personal belongings without explicit permission, respecting boundaries even in his absence. There was an unconscious grace to her movements that spoke of someone comfortable in her own skin, confident in her worth, despite society's tendency to overlook women like her. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense that marked the models and socialites who occasionally graced Mark's arm at business functions. Rosa's beauty was deeper, more substantial, the kind that came from strength, kindness, and an unshakable core of integrity. "Rosa," he called from his office doorway, surprising them both with the sudden urgency in his voice. She looked up from dusting his extensive book collection, her expression carefully neutral, in the way that suggested she was working hard to maintain professional boundaries after the intimacy they'd shared the previous evening. "Yes, Mr. Sullivan?" The formal address stung more than Mark had expected. After last night, after the way she'd looked at him in her kitchen, the return to professional distance felt like rejection. "How long have you been cleaning for me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. 3 years. 2 months and 16 days, she answered immediately, then flushed slightly at having revealed that she'd been keeping such precise track. "Why?" The question emerged before Mark could stop it, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Rosa set down her cleaning cloth and turned to face him fully, her dark eyes searching his face for clues about what he really wanted to know. "Because you pay very well, and you're never home to interfere with my work." It was a practical answer, professionally appropriate, but something in her eyes suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface, complications they were both trying to avoid acknowledging. "And now," Mark pressed, taking a step closer. "After last night." Rosa's gaze didn't waver, but he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Now I think maybe you needed someone who could see past the reputation to find the person underneath." Over the following weeks, Mark found himself manufacturing reasons to be home during Rosa's cleaning sessions, timing his schedule with unprecedented precision to ensure their paths would cross. What had once been purely professional interactions gradually evolved into something more complex and dangerous, genuine conversations that revealed layers of personality he'd kept buried for a decade. Rosa told him about Maria's extraordinary academic achievements, how she'd graduated high school as valedictorian, despite working part-time jobs to help support their family. She spoke with obvious pride about Elena's arthritis, the way her mother refused to let physical pain diminish her fierce independence or her joy in simple pleasures like tending the small herb garden on their fire escape. She mentioned her volunteer work at the community center on weekends, helping elderly immigrants navigate government paperwork and teaching children to read. In return, Mark found himself sharing carefully edited stories from his past, sanitized memories of his childhood in Queens before the Sullivan family gained power, his parents' old-fashioned courtship during the 1960s, his unexpected love for classic films from the 1940s. He was meticulously careful never to mention the family business, but Rosa proved perceptive enough to read between his carefully constructed lines. One snowy February afternoon, fate intervened when Rosa discovered Mark's most private sanctuary, the locked study he'd never allowed anyone to clean. The door had been left accidentally unlocked, following a late-night session with his accountant, and Rosa glimpsed inside while replacing towels in the adjacent bathroom. The walls were lined with photographs and newspaper clippings that told the story of a life both beautiful and tragic. Wedding pictures from 2010 showed Mark looking impossibly young and radiantly happy, his arm around a stunning blonde woman whose blue eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief. Family portraits captured moments of pure domestic bliss, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered around a decorated tree, birthday parties featuring a dark-haired little boy who shared Mark's stubborn chin and Sarah's brilliant smile, summer vacations at what looked like a house in the Hamptons. But then the photographs took a darker turn. Crime scene photos showed the twisted wreckage of what had once been a luxury sedan. Newspaper headlines screamed about car bombings and mob violence, with Sarah Sullivan and Thomas Sullivan listed among the victims. Funeral programs bore dates from December 2014, their elegant script a stark contrast to the magnitude of loss they represented. Rosa's heart clenched as she absorbed the full scope of Mark's tragedy. Sarah had been only 29 when she died. Tommy, the little boy whose gap-toothed grin had filled so many of these photographs, had been just 8 years old. A baby, really. Gone in an instant because of enemies who'd wanted to hurt the man they loved most. You weren't supposed to see any of that. Mark's voice came from behind her, carrying a deadly quietness that would have terrified most people. Rosa turned slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. "Mark, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. The door was open and They were everything to me," Mark interrupted, his voice cracking with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, much less express. Sarah wasn't just beautiful, though she was stunning. She was brilliant, had a PhD in art history, could debate politics or literature or philosophy for hours. She made me want to be worthy of her love, to become the kind of man she believed I could be. Mark moved further into the room, his eyes finding a particular photograph that showed the three of them at some kind of carnival, cotton candy and laughter, captured for eternity. "Tommy called me Superman. He actually believed his old man could do anything, fix anything, protect anyone." Mark's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. "Some Superman couldn't even save the two people who mattered most." Rosa stepped closer, ignoring every warning sign in Mark's rigid posture. Professional boundaries meant nothing when confronted with this level of human suffering. "Tell me exactly what happened to them." For a moment, Mark seemed poised to deflect, to retreat behind the walls that had protected him for so long. But something in Rosa's expression, the same unwavering compassion that had prompted her Christmas invitation, broke down his carefully constructed defenses. "The Torino family wanted to send me a message about territorial boundaries," Mark said quietly, each word precisely controlled. "They planted a remote-controlled bomb in Sarah's Mercedes. She was driving Tommy to soccer practice at the community center, the same place where she volunteered teaching art classes to underprivileged kids." His voice grew softer, more broken. "The explosion was visible from 6 blocks away. They died instantly, according to the medical examiner." Rosa reached for him then, her arms encircling his trembling frame without hesitation. For the first time in 10 years, Mark Sullivan allowed himself to be held, while the full weight of his grief crashed over him like a tsunami. "Toitru-san, I became a monster after they died," Mark whispered against Rosa's shoulder, her arms still wrapped protectively around his shaking frame in the sanctuary of his private study. The words tumbled out of him like water through a broken dam, 10 years of carefully suppressed emotion finally finding release. "So I spent months hunting down every person connected to their murders, every Torino soldier, every associate, every cousin who'd so much as shaken hands with the bastards who planned it." Rosa pulled back enough to see his face, her hands gentle against his cheeks, thumbs tracing the tears he couldn't seem to stop. "Grief makes us do things we never thought we were capable of. You don't understand," Mark said, his voice hollow with self-loathing. "I didn't just kill them, Rosa. I made them suffer first. I wanted them to feel helpless, terrified, exactly the way Sarah and Tommy must have felt in those final seconds." His eyes met hers, expecting to see revulsion or fear. Instead, he found only patient understanding. I enjoyed their pain. For months, that was the only thing that made me feel remotely alive. And then what happened? Then, nothing. For 10 years, just emptiness. No satisfaction, no peace, no purpose beyond maintaining power for its own sake. Mark's hands found hers, his voice growing softer but more intense. Until Christmas Eve, when you had the courage to invite a dangerous stranger into your family's home. Rosa saw the exact moment Mark realized what he'd just admitted, that she had awakened something in him he'd believed was dead forever. The vulnerability in his eyes was almost immediately replaced by familiar fear, the same terror that had driven him to avoid human connection for a decade. "Rosa," Mark said, stepping back with visible effort, "you have to understand the kind of life I lead, the enemies I've made over the years. What happened to Sarah and Tommy? It could happen to anyone who gets too close to me. So you've spent 10 years making sure nobody gets close enough to matter. It's safer for everyone involved." Rosa's eyes flashed with sudden fire, her gentle demeanor replaced by something far more challenging. Safer for whom exactly? For the people who might be foolish enough to love you, or for you who might have to risk feeling something real again? The accusation hit its target with surgical precision. Mark's face darkened with the kind of expression that had made federal prosecutors reconsider their career choices. Careful, Rosa. But Rosa had seen behind all his masks now. She knew the difference between the public monster and the private man, and she refused to be intimidated by theatrics. Careful of what? You'll fire me? Push me away? Do whatever it takes to ensure I leave before you have to experience genuine emotion. Mark's silence was acknowledgement enough. "I'm not Sarah," Rosa said quietly but with absolute conviction. "I'm not some innocent woman walking blindly into danger without understanding the consequences. I've been cleaning bloodstains from your shirts for 3 years, Mark. I've seen the guns hidden throughout your apartment, heard the late-night phone calls about territorial disputes and missing shipments. I know exactly who you are and what kind of world you inhabit. Then why would you—" "Because I also know who you are when you're not performing for your enemies or hiding behind the Sullivan name and 10 years of grief," Rosa interrupted. "I've seen you listen patiently to my mother's stories, encourage my daughter's ambitions, show genuine interest in other people's dreams and struggles. I know the man who could have chosen any expensive restaurant in Manhattan, but instead chose to spend Christmas in a cramped Queens apartment because it meant sharing real family connection." Mark stared at her for a long moment, truly seeing Rosa Martinez, for perhaps the first time since she'd walked into his life. Not just his cleaning lady, not just a convenient source of human contact, but a woman courageous enough to love a fundamentally broken man. "You're willing to risk everything," Mark said slowly, "for someone like me." Rosa's smile was radiant and certain. "I'm not risking anything, Mark. I'm choosing everything. There's a difference." The distinction hit Mark like a revelation. For 10 years, he'd thought about love exclusively in terms of loss, vulnerability, potential tragedy. Rosa was offering him a different perspective. Love as choice, as strength, as the foundation for building something meaningful, rather than simply another potential catastrophe. "I don't know how to do this anymore," Mark admitted. "How to care about someone without constantly calculating threats and exit strategies." "Then we'll figure it out together," Rosa said simply. "One day at a time." 3 days later, Rosa Martinez was leaving her evening shift at the Elmhurst Community Center when 2 men emerged from the shadows of the poorly lit parking lot. She'd been working late again, helping prepare materials for a children's reading program that provided books and tutoring to families who couldn't afford private education. The February night was bitter cold, and most of the other volunteers had left hours earlier, leaving Rosa alone with her thoughts and the satisfaction of work well done. The center sat in a part of Queens that had seen better decades, where streetlights were frequently broken and security cameras were considered luxury expenses. Rosa had always felt safe here. This was her neighborhood, her community, filled with people who knew her family and looked out for each other. But tonight, something felt different. Wrong. "Rosa Martinez." The taller man stepped out from behind a parked van, his expensive charcoal suit completely out of place in this working-class neighborhood. His voice carried a Brooklyn accent, but his dead eyes and the way he moved suggested professional training in violence. Rosa's mouth went dry, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Years of raising a daughter alone in New York had taught her never to show weakness to predators. "Who's asking?" "Friends of Mr. Mark Sullivan, the second man said with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. He was shorter but built like a wrestler, with scarred knuckles that spoke of extensive experience in hurting people. We'd like to have a friendly conversation with you. I don't discuss my employer with strangers. Rosa's hand slowly moved toward her purse, where she kept pepper spray and a small knife Elena had insisted she carry. The tall man noticed the movement and stepped closer, invading her personal space with practiced intimidation. Let me be more specific, Mrs. Martinez. You've been spending considerable personal time with Mark Sullivan lately. Christmas dinners, long private conversations, the way he looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching. His smile turned predatory. We know everything about your little romance. Rosa's blood turned to ice water. They'd been watching her, photographing her, studying her routines. The violation felt like insects crawling under her skin. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. The shorter man pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photographs that made her knees nearly buckle. Mark entering her apartment building, the two of them talking in his penthouse. Even worse, images of Maria walking across her college campus, completely unaware she was being stalked by dangerous men. Mr. Sullivan has something that belongs to our employer, the tall man continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than threatening her family. Port shipping schedules, security codes, personnel information. Nothing too complicated. You're going to help us acquire these materials. Rosa's mind raced, trying to understand what they meant while simultaneously calculating escape routes. She had no idea what shipping schedules they were referring to, but the threat was crystal clear. And if I refuse? The man's smile widened as he scrolled through more photos on his device. Beautiful girl, you're Maria. 19 years old, Dean's List student. Bright future ahead of her studying law at Queen's College. She takes the same subway route every day, leaves her morning statistics class at exactly 10:15, stops for coffee at that little shop on Northern Boulevard. He paused for effect. It would be such a tragedy if something happened to interrupt her promising academic career. Rosa's hands clenched into fists, maternal rage warring with terror. If you touch my daughter, You'll what, exactly? The man laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. You're a cleaning lady, Mrs. Martinez. We're professionals with resources you can't imagine. Your only choices are cooperation or watching your family experience the same fate as Sullivan's first wife and son. The reference to Sarah and Tommy hit like a physical blow. These weren't random criminals. They knew intimate details about Mark's history, his vulnerabilities, his greatest sources of pain. They'd clearly been planning this operation for months, possibly years. We'll be in touch with specific instructions, the shorter man said, pocketing his phone. You have 48 hours to think about our proposal. Consider carefully, Mrs. Martinez. Your daughter's life depends on making the right choice. After their black sedan disappeared into traffic, Rosa sat in her 15-year-old Honda for nearly 30 minutes, hands shaking too violently to start the engine. She considered calling the police, but what could she tell them? That anonymous men wanted her to steal from her employer? That they'd threatened her daughter, but hadn't actually committed any crimes yet? No, there was only one person in New York City with the power to handle this situation. Calling him would irrevocably change the nature of their relationship, dragging her family fully into his dangerous world. But Maria's safety was worth any personal cost. Rosa pulled out her phone and dialed Mark's private number with trembling fingers. "Mark," she said, when he answered on the second ring, her voice barely holding together. "I need your help. They know about us, and they're threatening Maria." Mark's midnight black Maserati devoured the miles between Manhattan and Queens like a predator sensing wounded prey, the powerful engine responding to his urgent need for speed with mechanical precision. Rosa's terrified voice continued echoing in his memory, the way it had cracked when she described the threats against Maria, the barely controlled panic that had bled through her usual composure. Every traffic light, every delayed second, felt like an eternity when someone he cared about was in danger. This was exactly what Mark had been afraid of from the beginning, the nightmare scenario he'd tried so desperately to avoid by keeping Rosa at arm's length. By allowing himself to care about her, by letting her matter to him, he'd painted a target on both her back and her daughter's. The guilt was already eating him alive, but that was a luxury he'd have to deal with later. Right now, Rosa needed him to be the dangerous man his enemies feared, rather than the broken soul she'd been trying to heal. Mark found Rosa waiting in her apartment, pacing the small living room like a caged animal, while Elena watched nervously from the kitchen doorway. The older woman had clearly sensed something was wrong, but Rosa had apparently decided to spare her the terrifying details. The moment Rosa saw Mark, she collapsed into his arms as if her legs had finally given out under the weight of her fear. "They have photographs of Maria walking to class," Rosa sobbed against his chest, her fingers gripping his shirt like a lifeline. "They know her schedule, her favorite coffee shop, the exact time she leaves statistics class. They said what happened to Sarah and Tommy could happen to my family too." Mark's jaw clenched as murderous rage filled every cell of his body, the kind of cold fury that had once reduced grown men to begging for mercy. But he forced himself to remain calm and controlled, to be the shelter Rosa needed right now rather than the storm he wanted to unleash on her enemies. "Tell me everything," Mark said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly authority that had built an empire. "Every detail, every word they used, every threat they made. Don't leave anything out." Rosa described the two men with the precision of someone who understood that lives might depend on accuracy, their approximate ages, physical descriptions, the make and model of their sedan, even the specific accent patterns in their speech. Mark listened with growing tension, his mind already cataloguing the information and cross-referencing it against known associates of rival families. "The Torinos," Mark said finally, his voice carrying grim certainty. "They're trying to move heroin shipments through my container ports without paying tribute. Those shipping schedules they want don't actually exist, Rosa. They're fishing, hoping I'll panic and reveal information about my security protocols. Can you just give them what they want to make this stop?" Mark's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. "Those documents are fabrications, sweetheart. They might as well be demanding unicorn blood. What they don't understand is that threatening you was the worst possible tactical mistake they could have made." "Mark, please," Rosa pleaded, grabbing his arms with desperate strength. "Don't make this situation worse. Don't turn this into some kind of war because of me." Mark took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones, while his eyes burned with an intensity that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him. "Rosa, listen to me very carefully. I'm going to handle this situation, but I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? I'm scared for my daughter. I know you are, but I swear to you on Sarah and Tommy's graves, nothing is going to happen to you or Maria. I won't let them take another family from me." The words carried such fierce conviction that Rosa felt some of her panic begin to subside. "But we need to get you both somewhere safe until this is resolved. What do you need me to do?" "Pack a bag with essentials for you and Maria. You're both staying with me until this threat is eliminated." Mark's tone brooked no argument. "This isn't a request, Rosa. They've made this personal, and I don't negotiate when it comes to protecting the people I love." The declaration hung between them like lightning, illuminating truths neither of them had been quite ready to speak aloud. Mark had just admitted, without reservation or qualification, that he loved her, and despite the fear coursing through her veins like poison, Rosa's heart soared. "Maria's still at her evening study group," Rosa said, already moving toward her bedroom to gather clothes. "She won't be home for another 2 hours. Tony's already on his way to collect her," Mark said, pulling out his phone to check messages. "She'll be escorted safely to my building without ever knowing she was in danger. You thought of everything." Mark's expression was grim but determined. "I've had 10 years to plan for this scenario, Rosa. I just never thought I'd have someone worth protecting again." 20 minutes later, they were driving through the Queens Midtown Tunnel in Mark's armored vehicle, Rosa clutching a hastily packed overnight bag, while bodyguards in a following sedan maintained discreet surveillance. The city lights blurred past the bulletproof windows like fallen stars, and Rosa realized her life had just changed irrevocably. She was no longer just Mark Sullivan's cleaning lady. She was his family under his protection, part of his dangerous world whether she'd chosen it or not. Mark's penthouse had been transformed overnight into an impenetrable fortress, with armed security guards positioned at strategic locations throughout the building and sophisticated surveillance equipment monitoring every possible entrance. The luxury apartment now buzzed with quiet activity, as Tony Castellano coordinated defensive measures while maintaining the appearance of normal business operations. Maria had been collected from her study group by 2 of Mark's most trusted men, who'd introduced themselves as private security consultants, hired to ensure her safety during what they described as a routine business dispute. The teenager had accepted this explanation with the resilient adaptability that came from growing up in Queens. though Rosa could see questions forming behind her daughter's intelligent eyes. "This feels like something out of a movie," Maria whispered to her mother as they settled into the palatial guest suite. "Are we in some kind of witness protection program?" Rosa couldn't bring herself to explain that they were in something far more complex and dangerous, under the protection of a man who would methodically destroy anyone who threatened their safety. Instead, she simply held her daughter close and assured her that everything would return to normal soon. That night, after Maria had finally fallen asleep despite the unfamiliar surroundings, Rosa found Mark standing alone on his private balcony. The city stretched endlessly below them, millions of lights, creating a constellation of human ambition and dreams. He'd spent hours making phone calls in rapid-fire Italian and Russian, his voice carrying the deadly authority that made powerful men reconsider their life choices. "How serious is this threat?" Rosa asked, wrapping a silk robe around herself against the March cold seeping through the bulletproof glass. Mark didn't turn around, his shoulders rigid with tension that suggested he was carrying the weight of impossible decisions. "Serious enough that I'm calling in favors from people who are normally my competitors. Serious enough that I'm prepared to start a war if diplomacy fails. Because of me." It wasn't a question. "Because you matter to me more than anything else in this world," Mark said, finally turning to face her. The raw emotion in his eyes took Rosa's breath away. Love and fear and desperate determination all warring for dominance. "I told myself for weeks that I could keep you at a safe distance, that caring about you wouldn't fundamentally change who I am or how I operate. I was completely wrong." Rosa stepped closer, her heart racing at the vulnerability she heard in his voice. "Mark, I love you, Rosa Martinez," he said with the same conviction he might use to declare war or negotiate a peace treaty. "I never wanted this to happen, never planned for it, never believed I was capable of feeling this way again. But somewhere between Christmas dinner in your apartment and watching you transform my empty house into something that feels like a home, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you." Rosa felt tears spring to her eyes at the sheer courage it had taken for him to speak those words. "Mark, I know it's impossible," Mark continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. "I know I'm being selfish by even telling you how I feel. My world is violence and danger and constant threats. I have enemies who would kill you just to hurt me, competitors who see kindness as weakness, obligations that require me to make choices no decent person should ever have to make." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "If something happens tomorrow during the confrontation I'm planning, I needed you to know that you brought me back to life." "What confrontation? What's happening tomorrow?" Mark's smile was sharp and dangerous, carrying all the predatory confidence that had built his empire. "I'm ending this threat permanently. The Torinos want a war? They're going to get exactly what they asked for." Rosa grabbed his arms, fear shooting through her like electricity. "Don't do this, please. There has to be another way to resolve this situation, some kind of negotiation or compromise. There is no other way. Rosa, this is who I am, what I do. I solve problems through superior force and strategic violence." "No," Rosa said fiercely, surprising them both with the vehemence in her voice. "That's what you do for work. Who you are is the man who held me while I cried about my fears for Maria, who listened patiently to my mother's stories about Puerto Rico and encouraged my daughter's academic dreams. Who you are is the man I fell desperately, completely in love with." The words hit Mark like a physical blow, stopping his prepared speech about duty and necessary violence. "Rosa, I love you too, Mark Sullivan. Every part of you, the broken pieces and the beautiful pieces and everything complicated in between. I love your strength and your vulnerability, your protective instincts and your capacity for tenderness. I love the way you make me feel safe and cherished and worthy of devotion." They came together then with the desperate hunger of two people who'd found something precious and irreplaceable in a world that seemed determined to destroy beautiful things. Mark's hands tangled in Rosa's dark hair as her fingers traced the scars on his knuckles. Battle wounds from a decade of violence she was choosing to accept as part of the man she loved. Their kiss was everything. Promise and passion, fear and hope. The collision of two souls who'd been incomplete until this moment. Tears, Rosa awakened in Mark's king-sized bed to find nothing but cold sheets and the lingering scent of his cologne on the Egyptian cotton pillowcase. Morning sunlight streamed through the bulletproof windows, casting geometric shadows across the marble floors of his bedroom suite. Her hand reached automatically for the warm body that should have been beside her, finding instead only a handwritten note in Mark's decisive script. Had to leave early for a meeting with the Torino representatives. Tony is maintaining security on the building. You and Maria are completely safe. This should all be over by tonight. I love you more than life itself. M. But something felt fundamentally wrong. The penthouse was too quiet, lacking the usual sounds of activity that had characterized the past few days. Rosa quickly dressed and went searching for Maria, her mother's intuition setting off alarm bells that grew louder with each empty room she discovered. "Maria!" Rosa called, her voice echoing through the vast apartment. "Mija, where are you?" She found Tony Castellano in the hallway outside Maria's room, unconscious and bleeding from a significant head wound. The sight of Mark's most trusted lieutenant, sprawled on the marble floor, sent terror racing through Rosa's veins like ice water. Someone had breached their supposedly impenetrable security. "Maria!" Rosa screamed, running through the penthouse with increasing desperation. Her daughter was gone, vanished as if she'd never existed, leaving only rumpled bedsheets and an ominous silence that spoke of professional abduction. Rosa's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and her hands shook so violently she could barely read the screen. "Pier 47 Red Hook, 1 hour, come alone, or the college girl learns what happened to the Sullivan boy." The reference to Tommy made Rosa's knees nearly buckle. These weren't random criminals or even simple extortionists. They were monsters who understood exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. With trembling fingers, Rosa tried calling Mark, but his phone went straight to an automated voicemail system. She tried Tony's emergency contact numbers, but he was still unconscious from whatever they'd done to him. Panic clawed at her throat as precious minutes ticked away, each second bringing her daughter closer to unthinkable danger. Rosa had no choice but to handle this herself. She grabbed Mark's spare car keys from his kitchen counter and raced toward the Brooklyn docks, her mother's heart overriding every rational thought about personal safety. Pier 47 was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses that reeked of rotting fish and industrial decay. The area had been largely deserted since the economic downturn, making it perfect for activities that required privacy and disposal options. Rosa found Maria in the center of an empty warehouse, bound to a metal chair with professional-grade restraints, but gloriously, defiantly alive. "Mommy," Maria sobbed when she saw her mother, tears streaming down her young face. But despite her obvious terror, there was fierce determination in her eyes, the same strength that had carried 3 generations of Martinez women through impossible circumstances. "Very touching reunion," a familiar voice said from the shadows behind towering stacks of abandoned crates. Vincent Torino stepped into the harsh warehouse lighting, flanked by armed men who moved with the casual confidence of career killers. Rosa recognized him from newspaper photos, a man in his 50s who'd inherited his father's criminal empire and expanded it through systematic brutality. The great Mark Sullivan, brought to his knees by a cleaning lady and her college-bound daughter. Vincent continued with obvious satisfaction. "I have to admit, Mrs. Martinez, you've accomplished something that federal prosecutors and rival families have been trying to achieve for decades." "Let my daughter go," Rosa said. Rosé, stepping forward despite the weapons pointed at her chest. "Your quarrel is with Mark, not with an innocent 19-year-old. "Oh, but she's not innocent anymore, is she? The moment you chose to love our emotionally unavailable crime boss, you dragged your precious daughter into a world where innocence is a luxury nobody can afford." Rosa's blood turned to Arctic ice. "Where is Mark? What have you done with him?" Vincent's smile was cruel and triumphant. "Right now, he's probably bleeding to death in a warehouse about 15 miles from here. You see, we gave him a choice. Save you and your daughter, or rescue some very important business associates we'd also kidnapped from his social club. Being the pragmatic businessman he is, he naturally chose to protect his revenue streams over his romantic entanglements." Rosa's heart shattered into pieces. After everything they'd shared, after all his promises and declarations of love, Mark had chosen his empire over her family when it truly mattered. "But don't worry about mourning his betrayal for very long," Vincent continued conversationally. "You won't be alive to feel disappointed for more than a few minutes." That's when Rosa heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines growing rapidly closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of vehicles moving at dangerous speeds through the narrow streets around the warehouse district. Vincent's men looked around nervously, weapons drawn and safety switches disengaged. "Expecting someone?" Vincent asked sarcastically, though Rosa could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The warehouse doors exploded inward as armored SUVs crashed through the corrugated metal barriers, and suddenly the cavernous space erupted in coordinated gunfire and tactical precision. Rosa threw herself toward Maria as armed figures in black tactical gear poured into the building, like an unstoppable force of nature. Through the chaos and gunsmoke, Rosa saw him, Mark Sullivan, very much alive and moving through the violence with the deadly grace of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of war. Alors que c'est, the gunfight was over in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Mark had timed urban warfare scenarios enough to automatically track such details, even during active combat. His superior tactical planning and overwhelming numerical advantage had reduced Vincent Torino's supposedly professional crew to scattered casualties and surrendering survivors. When the smoke cleared and the last echo of gunfire faded, Vincent Torino lay dead from 3 precision shots to center mass, and Rosa was holding her trembling but unharmed daughter, while Mark's elite security team secured the warehouse. "Are you injured?" Mark demanded, his hands running systematically over Rosa's body to check for wounds or trauma. His own white shirt was torn and stained with blood from multiple sources, but he ignored his injuries completely in favor of ensuring her safety. "Did they hurt you? Did anyone touch you inappropriately?" "We're fine," Rosa managed, though her voice was shaking with residual adrenaline. "But Mark, you're bleeding from multiple wounds. You need medical attention immediately." "Surface damage," Mark dismissed, though blood was seeping through his shirt in several places. "Tony? He'll live to complain about his headache," Tony Castellano reported, appearing at Mark's shoulder with a bandaged skull, but still functional despite the concussion that had laid him out for hours. "Doctors say he'll be back to normal within a week, though his pride might take longer to recover." "How did you find us?" Rosa asked, her analytical mind already working through the impossibility of his rescue timing. Mark's smile was grim but satisfied. "You think I don't have tracking devices integrated into everything I consider valuable? Your phone, Maria's backpack, even that gold necklace I gave you last month. They all broadcast GPS coordinates continuously." Rosa's hand automatically went to the delicate chain at her throat, the Valentine's Day gift she'd thought was simply beautiful jewelry. "You've been monitoring our locations this entire time." "Protecting you," Mark corrected with conviction that brooked no argument. "When my security system alerted me that both of you had left the building simultaneously, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. Nobody moves my family without permission. But Vincent said you chose to save your business associates instead of us. He said you'd been given an ultimatum." Mark's expression darkened with the kind of fury that had once reduced corrupt politicians to confessing their crimes voluntarily. Vincent Torino was a pathological liar and a strategic idiot. The business associates he claimed to have kidnapped were mannequins arranged in an abandoned building 15 blocks away. This entire operation was designed to separate us psychologically, to make you believe I'd abandoned you in favor of business considerations. Mark knelt down to Maria's eye level, his dangerous public persona completely absent as he addressed the young woman who'd become like family to him. "Maria, I want you to understand something very important. There is no choice when it comes to your safety and your mother's welfare. There will never be a choice. You and Rosa are my priority, are my family, my everything. That's what family means, unconditional protection." Maria spoke up from her mother's protective embrace, her voice shaky but determined despite everything she'd endured. "Mr. Sullivan, Mark, thank you for saving us, for everything you've done." Mark stood and wrapped both women in his arms, holding them against his chest, while his heartbeat gradually returned to normal for the first time in hours. The warehouse around them was being systematically cleared by his security team, evidence removed, and official explanations prepared for the inevitable police investigation. "There's something else you need to understand," Mark said softly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "This threat is completely eliminated now. Vincent Torino was the driving force behind their territorial ambitions, and with him gone, the remaining Torino operations will either fall in line or be absorbed by more reasonable competitors." "How can you be certain?" Rosa asked. "Because I spent the last 24 hours negotiating with every other crime family in the tri-state area," Mark explained with satisfaction. The Torinos had become a liability to everyone's business interests. Nobody wanted a war, but nobody wanted to move against Vincent without clear justification. His smile was sharp. Kidnapping civilians provided that justification. Rosa looked around the warehouse at the aftermath of violence that had been unleashed on her behalf, trying to reconcile her gentle nature with the brutal reality of Mark's world. Is this what our life will be like? Constant threats and armed responses? Mark considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would determine whether they had a future together or whether Rosa would decide his world was too dangerous for her family. Rosa, I can't promise you a life completely free from risk. My past and my business relationships will always carry certain complications, but I can promise you that nothing like this will ever happen again. After today, everyone in New York will understand that threatening my family is a fatal mistake. Mark, Rosa said quietly, take us home. His smile transformed his entire face from intimidating crime boss to the man who'd fallen in love with a woman brave enough to invite him to Christmas dinner. Which home? The penthouse or your apartment in Queens? It doesn't matter, Rosa realized with stunning clarity. Home is wherever we're all together, safe and loved. Mark held them both tighter, finally understanding that love wasn't a weakness to be feared, but a strength worth fighting for. The Torino threat was ended, but more importantly, Mark Sullivan had learned that building a family was more powerful than building an empire. 6 months later, Rosa Martinez Sullivan stood in the spacious kitchen of their new family home. Not Mark's sterile Manhattan penthouse or her cramped Queens apartment, but a beautiful colonial house in Westchester County where Maria could have a proper yard for studying and Elena could tend the extensive garden she'd always dreamed of cultivating. The transformation in all their lives had been nothing short of miraculous. Mark had officially stepped back from active criminal operations, transferring day-to-day control of his legitimate businesses to Tony Castellano, while converting the rest of his empire into legal enterprises. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been entirely clean, but Mark was determined to build something Maria could be proud to inherit someday, a legacy of business success rather than violence and fear. "Mommy, is everything ready?" Maria called from the dining room, where she was helping Elena arrange fresh flowers from their garden. Mark's family should be arriving any minute. Rosa smiled at how naturally her daughter now referred to Mark's extended network of relatives and close associates as family. The first few Sunday dinners had been awkward affairs, with former enforcers and money launderers trying to make polite conversation over Elena's traditional Puerto Rican cuisine. But Rosa's warm acceptance and genuine interest in their stories had gradually melted their suspicions and fears. "Almost finished, Mija," Rosa replied, checking the pernil that had been slow cooking all morning. The familiar aromas of garlic, oregano, and sofrito filled their home with the same love and tradition she'd grown up with, now shared with people who'd never experienced authentic family connection. Strong arms encircled Rosa from behind, and she leaned back against Mark's chest with the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd learned to trust completely. 6 months of safety and love had transformed him almost beyond recognition. The hollow-eyed man she'd first invited to Christmas dinner had been replaced by someone who smiled easily, laughed genuinely, and looked forward to the future instead of simply surviving each day. "How was your therapy session today?" Rosa asked, turning in his arms to study his face. Mark had been seeing Dr. Elizabeth Chen twice a week to work through his grief over Sarah and Tommy. It had been Rosa's suggestion, and though Mark had initially resisted the idea of discussing his emotions with a stranger, he'd grudgingly admitted the sessions were helping him process his guilt and anger in healthier ways. "Productive," Mark said with a slight smile. "Dr. Chen thinks I'm finally ready to visit Sarah and Tommy's graves, to introduce them properly to the woman who saved my life and gave me a reason to live again." Rosa felt tears spring to her eyes at the significance of what he was offering. "Do you want me to come with you?" "I was hoping you would. And Maria too, if she's willing. I want them to meet the family that brought me back from the dead." Mark paused, his voice growing softer but more intense. "I want them to know that their deaths weren't meaningless, that they led me to people who could love me despite everything I'd become." The doorbell chimed, followed by the familiar sounds of voices and laughter as their chosen family began arriving for Sunday dinner. Tony and his wife Carmen, carrying homemade cannoli from their bakery. Mark's cousin Michael, a successful architect who'd gone legitimate years ago, with his 2 teenage sons. Even Mark's elderly Aunt Rose from Boston, who'd initially been horrified by Rosa's humble background, but had been completely won over by her kindness and intelligence. "Ready?" Mark asked, taking Rosa's hand and leading her toward their living room. She looked around their kitchen, their home, filled with the sounds of people they loved. The walls held photographs of Maria's graduation from community college, Elena's 80th birthday celebration, even their small civil wedding ceremony, where Tony had served as best man and Maria as maid of honor. A year ago, Mark Sullivan had been a broken man spending Christmas alone in a fortress of wealth and isolation. Now he was surrounded by family, looking forward to a future bright with possibility and love. "Ready," Rosa said, squeezing his hand. They walked into their living room together, where Maria was animatedly describing her plans for law school, while Elena charmed everyone with stories from her youth. The room buzzed with genuine warmth and acceptance, love freely given and gratefully received. Mark caught Rosa's eye across the crowded room and mouthed the words that had become their daily promise. "Te amo, mi vida." Rosa touched the gold necklace at her throat, no longer a tracking device but a symbol of protection and devotion, and mouthed back, "Para siempre, mi amor." Sometimes the most powerful transformation comes not from conquering enemies or building empires, but from having the courage to let someone love you completely. And sometimes a simple Christmas invitation from a cleaning lady who sees past your monsters can change 2 lives forever. As Rosa watched Mark laugh at one of Elena's stories, while Maria explained constitutional law to his cousins, she knew they'd found something precious and rare, a love strong enough to survive any storm, a family worth protecting above all else, and a future built on hope instead of fear. The man who'd once ruled through intimidation had learned that the greatest strength comes from vulnerability. And the woman who'd worked multiple jobs to support her family had discovered that sometimes love means taking extraordinary risks for extraordinary rewards. Together they'd created something beautiful from the wreckage of the past, proving that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, and that families aren't just born, they're chosen, built and cherished one precious moment at a time.